In September 2024, Dr. Marcus Webb, a conservation specialist at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., began work on a daguerreotype that had been acquired from a private collector's estate in South Carolina. The photograph, dated 1858, showed a wealthy plantation family posed on the front portico of their Greek Revival mansion, a father, mother, and 3 children arranged formally in the ornate style typical of expensive photographic portraits from the late antebellum period. And what made this particular image significant to the museum's collection was the presence of enslaved individuals in the photograph. Standing behind and to the sides of the white family were 5 enslaved people, 3 adults and 2 children, included in the portrait in a way that displayed them as property, as symbols of the family's wealth and status, much like the mansion, the fine clothing, and the expensive furniture visible in the composition. The daguerreotype had deteriorated significantly over 166 years. The silver-plated copper surface had tarnished, creating dark spots and areas of discoloration that obscured portions of the image. Scratches from improper handling had damaged the delicate surface. The protective glass that originally covered the daguerreotype had cracked, allowing moisture and contaminants to accelerate the degradation. The leather case that housed the daguerreotype had rotted away, leaving the image exposed to environmental damage. Marcus's task was to digitally restore the photograph, using advanced imaging technology and conservation techniques to recover as much detail as possible from the damaged original. This work was painstaking and required both technical expertise and historical sensitivity, especially when dealing with images that documented the brutal institution of slavery. He began by creating high-resolution scans of the daguerreotype using specialized equipment designed for fragile historical photographs. The scanning process took several hours, capturing the image at multiple wavelengths of light to reveal details invisible to the naked eye. Different types of damage and different layers of the photographic emulsion responded differently to various light wavelengths, allowing Marcus to digitally reconstruct information that appeared lost in conventional viewing. When the initial scans appeared on his computer screen, Marcus spent several minutes simply studying the composition, trying to understand the social dynamics captured in this single frozen moment from 1858. The white family occupied the center and foreground of the image. The father, seated in an ornate chair, radiating patriarchal authority. The mother, standing beside him with her hand on his shoulder in a gesture of wifely support. 3 children arranged around them in descending order of age and importance. The enslaved individuals were positioned carefully to reinforce the family's status while remaining visually subordinate, standing rather than seated, positioned in the background and edges of the frame, their bodies angled to suggest service and deference. Their expressions were difficult to read due to the damage to the photograph, but Marcus could see enough to recognize the studied blankness that enslaved people often adopted in the presence of their enslavers, a protective mask that revealed nothing of their true thoughts or feelings. Marcus began the restoration process by addressing the most obvious damage, the tarnishing and discoloration that obscured large portions of the image. Using sophisticated digital restoration software, he worked methodically to remove these layers of deterioration, revealing the original photographic information beneath. The process was similar to cleaning centuries of grime from an old painting, except done entirely digitally to avoid any risk of further damaging the fragile original daguerreotype. As the image clarity improved, more details emerged. The white family's clothing became sharper and more defined. The father's expensive suit with its silk vest and gold watch chain, the mother's elaborate dress with its multiple layers of fabric and intricate trim, the children's formal attire that mimicked adult fashions in miniature. The mansion behind them showed its architectural grandeur more clearly. Tall columns, ornate molding, expensive furnishings visible through the open doorway. Marcus then shifted his attention to the enslaved individuals in the photograph, using the restoration tools to enhance the areas where they appeared. This was where the most significant damage had occurred, almost as if time itself had tried to erase their presence from the historical record. Large areas of tarnishing had darkened their figures, and several deep scratches cut across their bodies in the image. As Marcus worked to restore these damaged areas, removing digital noise and reconstructing missing information based on the surrounding pixels and his knowledge of daguerreotype photographic characteristics, he began to notice details that made him pause and lean closer to his screen. One of the enslaved children, a boy who appeared to be perhaps 8 or 9 years old, stood at the far right edge of the photograph. He wore simple clothing, rough cotton pants and a plain shirt, barefoot despite the formal nature of the portrait. His face, as Marcus enhanced the resolution and clarity, showed an expression of such profound sadness and resignation that it was difficult to look at directly. But it was the boy's hands that captured Marcus's attention and wouldn't let go. The child's right hand hung at his side, positioned in a way that seemed awkward and unnatural. As Marcus increased the magnification and adjusted the contrast to bring out more detail, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. Around the boy's wrist, partially hidden by the positioning of his arm and obscured by the photograph's damage, was a metal band. At first, Marcus thought it might be a bracelet or some kind of decorative item, but as he continued to enhance the image, the terrible reality became clear. It was a shackle, a small iron cuff connected to a short length of chain that extended up the boy's forearm, disappearing into his sleeve. Marcus sat back from his computer, his heart pounding. In all his years of working with historical photographs documenting slavery, he had never seen an image that so blatantly displayed the physical chains of bondage. Enslaved people were often photographed, but usually the physical instruments of their oppression, the chains, the shackles, the whips, were kept out of frame, hidden from the camera's eye as if to maintain the fiction that slavery was somehow benign or paternalistic rather than brutal and violent. Marcus immediately called his colleague, Dr. Aisha Johnson, a historian specializing in slavery and visual culture of the antebellum South. She arrived at his workstation within minutes, her expression shifting from curiosity to shock as Marcus showed her the enhanced image of the enslaved child's shackled wrist. "I've never seen anything like this," Aisha said quietly, leaning close to the screen. Plantation families who commissioned formal portraits usually wanted to project an image of themselves as benevolent masters, kind patriarchs, presiding over a supposedly contented workforce. They wouldn't typically want visible evidence of violence or coercion in their family photographs. Why would this family allow, or even want, chains to be visible in their portrait? "That's what I've been trying to understand," Marcus replied. "But look at this, there's more." He navigated to another area of the image, focusing on a different enslaved person, a woman who appeared to be in her 30s, standing behind the white family's mother. Marcus had enhanced this portion of the photograph as well, and what he had discovered was equally disturbing. The woman's dress had long sleeves despite the photograph, apparently being taken in warm weather, judging by the light quality and the fact that the white family's children wore lighter summer clothing. But the restoration process had revealed something the original tarnishing had hidden. The sleeves of the woman's dress were torn at the wrists, and through those tears, more metal was visible. She too wore shackles, iron bands that circled both wrists, connected by a short chain that allowed her hands to move, but only within a limited range. "The photograph was staged to display these chains," Aisha said, her voice tight with anger and sorrow. "The enslaved people weren't positioned accidentally. They were deliberately arranged so that an observant viewer would see the instruments of their bondage. This wasn't just documenting the family's wealth, it was documenting their power, their complete control over other human beings." Marcus continued navigating through the restored image, examining each of the 5 enslaved individuals with careful attention. Not all of them showed visible chains, but the 3 who did, the young boy, the adult woman, and another young person who appeared to be in their mid-teens, all displayed the same type of iron shackles, all partially concealed but still visible to anyone who looked closely enough. "We need to identify this family," Aisha said. "We need to know who they were, where this plantation was located, and what happened to the enslaved people in this photograph. These chains tell us something important about how this particular enslaver operated, about the specific brutality they employed. This image is evidence, documentation of a crime against humanity, preserved by the very people who committed it." Marcus nodded and began the process of trying to identify the photograph's origins. The daguerreotype case, though deteriorated, had contained a partial label that he had photographed during the initial documentation. Using image enhancement, he was able to make out portions of text, Sorth Plantation, and below that, Olena, 1858. The partial text provided a crucial starting point. Marcus and Aisha began researching plantations in South Carolina with names ending in Swarth. Within hours, they had identified a likely candidate, Edgesworth Plantation, located in the Lowcountry region near Charleston, one of the wealthiest and most productive rice-growing areas in the antebellum South. Edgesworth Plantation had been owned by the Beaumont family for 3 generations before the Civil War. In 1858, the year the daguerreotype was taken, the plantation was owned by William Beaumont III, who had inherited the property and its enslaved workforce from his father in 1852. Historical records indicated that Edgesworth was a large plantation, encompassing over 2,000 acres of rice fields and controlling the labor of more than 200 enslaved people at its peak. Aisha accessed the South Carolina Historical Society's digital archives and located several documents related to Edgesworth Plantation. Among them were plantation account books that had somehow survived the Civil War and Reconstruction, providing detailed records of the plantation's operations, including lists of enslaved people owned by the Beaumont family. "Here," Aisha said, pulling up a document dated January 1858, the same year as the photograph. "This is an inventory of enslaved people at Edgesworth, compiled for insurance purposes. It lists names, ages, estimated monetary value, and sometimes brief physical descriptions or notes about skills and behavior." She scrolled through the list, which contained over 180 names, each one representing a human being reduced to property, assigned a monetary value like livestock or equipment. The inventory was organized by family groups when applicable, showing how enslaved families were documented even as they remained vulnerable to being separated and sold at their enslaver's whim. Marcus pointed to an entry about halfway down the list. Samuel, male child, age 8, field hand in training, noted as difficult and requiring restraint, value $400. "That could be the boy in the chains," Marcus said quietly. "The age matches, and that note about requiring restraint would explain why he was shackled even for a formal photograph." They continued searching and found 2 more entries that might correspond to the other shackled individuals in the daguerreotype. Rachel, female, age 34, house servant, prone to running, kept secured, value 900, and Isaiah, male youth, age 15, field hand, repeated escape attempts, maximum security required, value $700. The clinical language of the inventory barely concealed the human tragedy it documented. Samuel, Rachel, and Isaiah, if these identifications were correct, had been people who resisted their enslavement, who tried to escape or fought against their oppression in ways that led their enslaver to keep them in chains. The photograph captured them in a moment of complete powerlessness. Their resistance literally bound in iron, their suffering put on display as a demonstration of William Beaumont's absolute control over their lives. "We need to find out what happened to them," Aisha said. "Did they survive the war? Were they freed? Did they leave any records, any testimony about their experiences?" Over the following weeks, Marcus and Aisha pursued every available historical record that might shed light on the fates of the enslaved people in the photograph, particularly Samuel, Rachel, and Isaiah, whose chains had been so carefully documented in that 1858 daguerreotype. Their search led them to the Freedmen's Bureau records, the collection of documents created after the Civil War to assist formerly enslaved people in their transition to freedom. These records included labor contracts, marriage certificates, educational enrollment lists, and testimony collected from freed people about their experiences under slavery. In the Freedmen's Bureau records for South Carolina, filed in 1865, they found a statement given by a man who identified himself as Samuel Morrison. The surname Morrison was significant. Many formerly enslaved people adopted new surnames after emancipation, often choosing the names of ancestors, places that held meaning, or simply names that represented their new identity as free people. Some researchers had suggested that the choice of certain surnames might have been a way of honoring or remembering those who had died in slavery. Samuel Morrison's testimony, recorded by a Freedmen's Bureau agent in Charleston in October 1865, began with a description of his background. "I was born into slavery at Edgeworth Plantation in South Carolina in approximately 1850. I do not know my exact birth date, as such records were not kept for enslaved children. My mother was named Dinah, and she worked in the plantation house. My father was sold away before I was old enough to remember him." Marcus and Aisha read on, their attention intensifying as Samuel's testimony continued. "From the time I was very young, I knew that the life we lived was wrong, that we should not be held as property, made to work without pay, beaten and brutalized at our master's whim. When I was perhaps 6 or 7 years old, I tried to run away. I did not get far. A child alone has little chance of successful escape. And I was caught and returned to the plantation. The punishment was severe. Master Beaumont had me whipped, and then he ordered the blacksmith to forge shackles for my wrists and ankles. From that point forward, I was kept in chains whenever I was not actively working under direct supervision." The testimony matched the photograph exactly. This was the same Samuel, the 8-year-old boy whose shackled wrist had been captured in the daguerreotype. Samuel's account continued. In 1858, Master Beaumont decided to have a photograph made of his family. This was an expensive undertaking, requiring a photographer to travel from Charleston with all his equipment. Master Beaumont wanted to show his wealth and status, and so he had several of us enslaved people included in the portrait, positioned around his family like furniture or decorative objects. I was made to stand at the edge of the photograph, still wearing my chain. Master Beaumont said the chains should be visible. He wanted anyone who saw the photograph to understand his complete power over us, to see that he could break even the most resistant spirit. Samuel's testimony provided crucial confirmation of what the photograph documented. But Aisha wanted to find records for the other individuals as well, particularly Rachel, the woman whose shackled wrists had been visible through the torn sleeves of her dress. After extensive searching through Freedmen's Bureau records, pension applications from formerly enslaved people, and oral histories collected in the early 20th century, Aisha found a recorded interview with a woman named Rachel Freeman, conducted in 1935 as part of the Federal Writers Project, a Depression-era program that collected testimonies from the last surviving formerly enslaved people. Rachel Freeman, who would have been 71 years old at the time of the interview, described her life at Edgeworth Plantation in vivid and heartbreaking detail. The interviewer noted that Mrs. Freeman spoke with difficulty about her experiences, often pausing to compose herself before continuing. "I was born free in Virginia," Rachel's testimony began, shocking both Marcus and Aisha, who had assumed all the enslaved people at Edgeworth had been born into slavery. "My parents were free black people, poor but free. When I was 12 years old in 1847, I was kidnapped by slave traders while walking home from the market. Such things happened. Free black people, especially children, were vulnerable to being kidnapped and sold into slavery in the Deep South, where no one knew them and their free papers could be destroyed or ignored." The testimony continued. "I was taken to South Carolina and sold to William Beaumont of Edgeworth Plantation. I told everyone I was free, that I had been kidnapped, but no one would listen. Who would believe a black child's word against the papers of sale that the slave traders provided? I was put to work in the plantation house, serving Master Beaumont's family. But I never accepted my enslavement. I knew I was meant to be free because I had been born free. I had tasted freedom, and I could not forget it. Rachel described multiple escape attempts, each one resulting in brutal punishment when she was captured and returned to the plantation. After my third attempt to escape in 1856, Master Beaumont decided that ordinary punishment was insufficient. He had iron shackles made for me, bands that locked around my wrists and were connected by a chain. I wore those chains every day, every night, for years. They rubbed my skin raw. The weight of them made my shoulders and arms ache constantly. But worse than the physical pain was what those chains represented. The complete theft of my humanity, the reduction of my body to an object that could be restrained and controlled. The testimony confirmed that Rachel was indeed the woman in the photograph, and it provided context for why William Beaumont had wanted the chains visible in his family portrait. He was making a statement about his power, about his ability to break the spirit of even those who had known freedom and fought desperately to reclaim it. Rachel's interview continued with her account of the Civil War years and eventual freedom. When Union soldiers came through our area in 1865, I was finally freed. The first thing I did was have those shackles removed. The blacksmith who took them off said my wrists had permanent scars from years of wearing the chains. I still have those scars today, 70 years later. They remind me every day of what I survived and what I lost. The years of my youth spent in bondage, stolen from me by men who believed they had the right to own other human beings. While Marcus and Aisha worked to uncover the stories of the enslaved people in the photograph, they also researched the Beaumont family themselves, trying to understand the mentality that would lead someone to not only enslave people and keep them in chains, but to document that brutality in a formal family portrait. William Beaumont III left extensive records, letters, diaries, business correspondence, and legal documents that provided insight into how he understood himself and his actions. These documents were preserved at the South Carolina Historical Society, part of the Beaumont family papers donated decades after the Civil War. What emerged from these records was a portrait of a man who saw himself as entirely justified in his actions, who believed sincerely that slavery was not only economically necessary but morally correct and divinely ordained. His letters frequently referenced religious justifications for slavery, citing biblical passages and arguing that enslaving Africans was actually beneficial to them, bringing them to Christianity and civilization. In a letter dated March 1858, just months before the daguerreotype was taken, William Beaumont wrote to his brother, "I have found it necessary to maintain strict discipline among the more rebellious elements of my workforce. Several have shown persistent tendencies toward escape and insubordination. I have implemented measures to ensure their compliance, including physical restraints for the most problematic individuals. Some may view these methods as harsh, but they are essential for maintaining order and productivity. A master who is not willing to exercise firm control over his property will soon find his plantation falling into chaos and financial ruin." Another letter, dated June 1858, discussed the daguerreotype directly. "I have commissioned a photograph of my family to be made this month. It is a significant expense, but I believe it important to document our position and prosperity for posterity. I have decided to include several of the enslaved workers in the portrait, positioned appropriately to reflect the natural social order. Some are displaying the restraints necessary for their management. I believe this accurately represents the reality of plantation life and the challenges of maintaining discipline among an inferior race that requires constant supervision and control." The casual, matter-of-fact tone in which Beaumont discussed keeping human beings in chains, the complete absence of any recognition that he was committing profound moral wrongs. These documents were difficult for Marcus and Aisha to read, but they were important for understanding the full historical context of the photograph. They also found records showing what happened to William Beaumont after the Civil War. Like many plantation owners, he lost most of his wealth when slavery was abolished and his property, the human beings he had enslaved, became free. Edgeworth Plantation struggled financially during Reconstruction and was eventually sold. William Beaumont died in 1879, reportedly bitter about the loss of his way of life and the social and economic changes that Reconstruction had brought to the South. The third person in the photograph, who was visibly shackled, the young person identified as Isaiah in the 1858 plantation inventory, proved more difficult to trace. Unlike Samuel and Rachel, whose testimonies had survived in historical records, Isaiah seemed to have disappeared from the documentary record after 1858. Marcus and Aisha searched extensively through Freedmen's Bureau records, census data, death records, and every other available source, but they could find no clear evidence of what happened to Isaiah after the Civil War. It was possible he had died during the war years, when many enslaved people perished from disease, violence, or the harsh conditions that prevailed as the Confederacy collapsed. It was also possible he had survived but left no records that researchers could access 166 years later. However, Aisha eventually found a brief mention in the diary of a Union officer who had been stationed near Charleston in February 1865, just months before the war ended. The officer, Captain Robert Hastings of Massachusetts, described encountering formerly enslaved people who had fled Edgeworth Plantation as Union forces advanced through the area. February 12, 1865. Today we were approached by a group of approximately 30 colored refugees who had escaped from a nearby plantation as our forces drew near. Among them was a young man, perhaps 19 or 20 years of age, who bore terrible scars on his wrists and ankles from years of wearing iron shackles. He said his name was Isaiah and that he had been kept in chains since childhood because he had repeatedly tried to escape. When I asked what he would do now that he was free, he said simply, "I will walk wherever I wish to walk, and no man will ever put chains on me again." The quiet determination in his voice moved me deeply. If this was the same Isaiah from the Edgeworth Plantation inventory and the 1858 photograph, then he had survived years in chains and lived to see freedom. But beyond this brief mention, the historical record remained silent about his fate. Like so many formerly enslaved people, Isaiah's full story was lost to time, his experiences in his post-war life unrecorded or surviving only in records that had not yet been discovered or digitized. This absence itself was significant, Marcus and Aisha recognized. The vast majority of enslaved people left no written records, no testimony, no documentation beyond their presence in plantation inventories that listed them as property. The silence in the historical record represented millions of lives, stories, experiences, and perspectives that had been erased or never recorded in the first place. Isaiah's story matters even though we can't fully recover it, Aisha said. His presence in that photograph, the chains on his body, the fact that he apparently survived to see freedom, these fragments are important. They represent all the stories we'll never be able to tell completely, all the people whose suffering and resistance we can only glimpse through fragmentary evidence. In March 2025, the National Museum of African American History and Culture opened a special exhibition titled Visible Chains, Documenting Slavery's Violence. The centerpiece was the restored daguerreotype from Edgeworth Plantation, displayed with detailed annotations identifying Samuel, Rachel, and Isaiah, and explaining the significance of the visible chains in the photograph. The exhibition also included the testimonies from Samuel and Rachel, allowing visitors to read their own words, describing the experience of being kept in chains, of being displayed as objects in William Beaumont's family portrait, and of eventually achieving freedom. Large text panels provided historical context about slavery in the South Carolina Low Country, the economics of rice plantation slavery, the various methods enslavers used to control and punish enslaved people who resisted, and the lasting trauma of slavery that extended far beyond the formal end of the institution in 1865. The museum also commissioned a contemporary artist, Jerome Williams, to create a companion piece to the historical photograph. Williams's large-scale painting reimagined the daguerreotype, but with a crucial difference. In his version, the chains that had bound Samuel, Rachel, and Isaiah lay broken on the ground, and the three formerly enslaved people stood in the foreground of the composition, dignified and free, while the Beaumont family faded into shadow in the background. The painting was titled Breaking the Frame, referencing both the literal breaking of chains and the metaphorical breaking of the narrative frame that had centered enslavers rather than enslaved people in historical memory. The exhibition drew enormous crowds and intense media attention. News outlets across the country covered the story of the restored photograph and the chains it revealed. The image sparked difficult but necessary conversations about how slavery is depicted in historical photographs, about the ways enslavers documented their own violence, and about the importance of centering the experiences and perspectives of enslaved people when interpreting historical evidence. Some visitors found the photograph almost too painful to view directly. Museum staff reported that many people wept when they saw the image of young Samuel, a child of 8 wearing chains that represented the complete theft of his childhood and his freedom. The museum provided trained counselors and quiet spaces for visitors who found the exhibition emotionally overwhelming, recognizing that the photograph and the stories it told carried profound weight, especially for African American visitors whose own ancestors had experienced slavery's brutality. The exhibition also generated important scholarly discussions. Historians debated what the visible chains in the Beaumont family portrait revealed about how some enslavers understood and displayed their power. Most plantation photographs from the antebellum period, the relatively few that included enslaved people at all, showed them without visible instruments of bondage, as if to maintain a fiction of slavery as somehow benign or paternalistic. The Beaumont daguerreotype was unusual, perhaps even unique in its explicit display of chains, and scholars worked to understand what this suggested about William Beaumont's particular ideology and his desire to document his absolute control over the people he enslaved. 3 months after the exhibition opened, the museum received a letter that would add another profound dimension to the story. The letter was from a woman named Jasmine Morrison, a retired teacher living in Philadelphia, who had visited the exhibition and recognized the name Samuel Morrison from her own family history. "My great-great-great-grandfather was named Samuel Morrison," Jasmine wrote. "Family stories passed down through generations always said he had been enslaved in South Carolina and wore chains as a child. We thought these might be exaggerated memories, the kind of stories that get embellished over time. But when I saw the photograph in your exhibition and read the testimony from Samuel Morrison in the Freedmen's Bureau records, I realized our family stories were true. The Samuel in your photograph is my ancestor. Marcus and Aisha immediately contacted Jasmine and arranged to meet with her and several other members of the Morrison family who gathered in Washington, D.C. to see the photograph and learn more about their ancestor's story. When Jasmine stood before the daguerreotype for the first time, knowing with certainty that the 8-year-old boy in chains was her own great-great-great-grandfather, she wept. "I'm looking at a child, my ancestor, being brutalized, being kept in chains, and displayed like an object," she said quietly. "It's almost unbearable. But I'm also grateful that this photograph exists, that it documents what Samuel survived. My family exists because he survived those chains, because he lived to see freedom, because he built a life after slavery despite everything that had been done to him." The Morrison family shared their oral histories about Samuel, stories that had been passed down through 5 generations. After emancipation, Samuel had moved to Philadelphia as part of the Great Migration, seeking opportunities in the North. He had learned to read and write, skills that had been forbidden to him during slavery, and had become a passionate advocate for education and civil rights. He married, had 6 children, worked as a carpenter, and lived to the age of 78, dying in 1928. One of the stories we always heard about Samuel was that he refused to wear watches or bracelets or anything around his wrists, Jasmine said. "Now I understand why. Those chains had marked him, physically and psychologically. Even decades after they were removed, he couldn't bear to have anything constraining his wrists. He valued his freedom so deeply because he had experienced its absence in the most brutal way possible." The museum organized a special program where members of the Morrison family spoke about Samuel's life and legacy, providing the rest of the story that the 1858 photograph had captured only a single terrible moment of. Their testimonies transformed the daguerreotype from a document of victimization into a more complete narrative of survival, resistance, and the long journey from slavery to freedom. The museum also launched an initiative to locate descendants of Rachel and Isaiah, if any existed, and could be identified. While Isaiah's descendants were never definitively located, researchers eventually connected with a family in Virginia who believed they were descended from Rachel Freeman. Like the Morrison family, they had heard stories passed down through generations about an ancestor who had been born free, kidnapped into slavery, and spent years wearing chains before finally reclaiming her freedom. The exhibition ran for 18 months, far longer than originally planned, because of continued public interest and the ongoing discovery of additional historical information related to the photograph and the people it depicted. When it finally closed, the restored daguerreotype was added to the museum's permanent collection, where it continues to serve as a powerful testament to slavery's violence and to the resilience of those who survived it. The photograph that William Beaumont commissioned in 1858 to display his wealth and power had become instead a memorial to Samuel, Rachel, and Isaiah, and to the millions of other enslaved people whose suffering and resistance the chains represented. The restoration project that had revealed those hidden chains had also, in a sense, broken them by ensuring that the people who wore them would be remembered not as property, but as human beings who fought for their freedom and whose descendants carry their legacy forward. Marcus Webb, reflecting on the project years later, said, "That photograph could have remained in a private collection, its details obscured by damage and time, the chains invisible and the story untold. Instead, through restoration and research, we recovered not just an image, but the voices and experiences of people who had been deliberately silenced. We gave Samuel, Rachel, and Isaiah back their names, their stories, and their rightful place in history. That's the power of this work. It's not just about preserving the past, it's about ensuring that all people's stories, especially those who were oppressed and marginalized, are told and remembered."